Since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine nearly 4 weeks ago, President Biden has asserted on a number of occasions that he's not sending US troops into this conflict, but sending US troops to neighboring countries to support NATO allies has been on the table. And later this week, Biden will attend a NATO summit in Belgium where he'll review options for a permanent increase in the number of US troops in Eastern Europe. In February, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the US sent about 5,000 troops to the region, mostly in Poland. Sending more troops to NATO countries would be a pretty big development, considering the NATO alliance is at the center of this conflict and part of why Russia says they invaded Ukraine in the first place. Also ahead of the summit, NATO announced it'd be deploying 4 battle groups, units with hundreds of troops, to quote, strengthen NATO's posture in the East. So it's worth taking a look back on the history of how NATO came together ahead of the summit this week. National correspondent Ben Schamisso explains more.
Thousands of NATO troops training in Norway, not far from the country's border with Russia. NATO says the drills are not linked to the war in Ukraine, but it is on everyone's mind.
While this exercise has been long planned, it takes place against a dark backdrop.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine is putting the 30-country alliance on high alert and testing its core principle like never before.
Our commitment to Article 5 is ironclad.
For more than 70 years, NATO's Article 5 has stated that an armed attack against one member nation is an attack against all, an attractive protection especially for smaller countries. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created in 1949 by the US, Canada, and 10 Western European nations as a counterweight to the Soviet Union.
NATO was designed to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out.
Since then, the alliance has more than doubled in size, adding 14 Central and Eastern European countries in the past 25 years. Ukraine and Georgia were once part of the USSR, and when they expressed interest in joining NATO in 2008, Russian President Vladimir Putin responded by invading Georgia. Putin says NATO's eastern expansion is an existential threat to his country. Earlier this year, he demanded that NATO retreats from Eastern Europe and bar Ukraine from ever joining the alliance. But former NATO officials tell Newsy NATO is not about aggression.
The real issue here is Putin does not want any of the countries on his borders to orient themselves towards the West.
In fact, for many current and aspiring members, joining the alliance means protection from Russia.
It's not moving east, so to speak, as the East is moving towards it. And that's what is fundamentally misunderstood sometimes, was as people try to react to what Putin says.
NATO, which struggled to find a role in a post-Cold War world, has been greatly revitalized.
Mr. Putin has given it a real shot in the arm.
The bloc has been acting with surprising speed and unity in sanctioning Russia and supplying weapons to Ukraine, despite Russia warning they might target weapon transfers. The alliance is now under pressure from Ukraine to do more, though how much more is the ultimate question.
It is very important that the alliance present a unified message that it will defend every inch of NATO territory. But on the other hand, because of Putin's strategic nuclear and tactical nuclear capability, no one wants to start a war.
On Thursday, President Biden and others will try to figure out how to strike that delicate balance. Putin will likely be watching. Ben Schamisso, Newsy.
All right, thanks for that, Ben. Let's look back at what's been happening in Ukraine this week. The siege of Ukraine's port city Mariupol continues and now includes long-range shelling from Russian naval ships, according to a U.S. defense official. Russian rockets have been hitting residential areas near Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital. Meanwhile, in Russia, there have been a number of high-profile protests and resignations and shutdowns across media outlets over the war in Ukraine. The entire staff of the last independent Russian channel TV Rain walked out on air after they were shut down by the Russian government. Ukrainian refugees continue their journey west into Europe, where many countries are offering thousands of jobs specifically for refugees to help them settle quickly. According to the UN, more than 3.5 million people have fled Ukraine since the invasion began. One thing that stands out about this conflict, and something folks online have been chatting about, is that this situation seems like a different story than what we've seen with other influxes of migrants and refugees in Europe. Our friends at the Washington Post video team look into how the media itself has been handling the Ukrainian refugee story differently from other conflicts.
The war in Ukraine is absolutely receiving wall-to-wall coverage, as it should.
As Russia's military assault of Ukraine is underway,
Russian forces are said to be making a renewed push towards Ukraine's capital, Kyiv.
Live in Dnipro, Ukraine. And
targets today the eastern city of Kharkiv.
One of the troubling things that some experts have noticed is the tone that people are taking in order to contextualize some of the coverage is casting offensive comparisons about what Ukrainians are experiencing versus what people who've been involved in other wars and other crises have experienced.
Shelters, but this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
These are prosperous middle-class people. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
What's sad really is how casual and spontaneous those comments happened. Like the way that they were said showed like real bias that we would think journalists covering such, major events would be above. So there were several comments that were very disheartening.
One of the things that we've seen in the coverage of Ukrainian refugees is Ukrainian refugees are immediately referred to as refugees, whereas there were examples in other coverage with wars in Africa and the Middle East where the people affected by those conflicts were simply called migrants.
Some 75,000 migrants have moved through Bosnia-Herzegovina into neighboring countries.
Turning overseas, about 100 migrants are missing in the Mediterranean.
There are some commentators who are referring to the refugees as it being unusual to see refugees with blonde hair and blue eyes.
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles.
So there's an overall sympathetic characterization of Ukrainians that are being displaced that we haven't always seen in other conflicts.
Stereotypes that people in places like the Middle East or South Asia or Latin America are less civilized. They're constantly in conflict. They're less worthy of being accepted as refugees. It's less serious because it's happening there. So I feel like these comments, that's exactly what they do.
This is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
What we report on, what we say makes a difference. It has an impact. People are watching and they are listening and reading. We have a responsibility to do it right and to not push and reinforce stereotypes.